Multi-column layout resembles Flexbox layout in that it gives us a lot of layout flexibility. The difference is that the multi-column feature is primarily designed for text layout or creating multiple text columns. It introduces a new type of container where content can flow from one column to another, and the number of columns can vary depending on the viewport size. We're also able to determine the column width, spacing, rules, and more, all with simple CSS properties. Let's find out how. The multi-column layout feature is currently supported unprefixed in IE10 and Opera 12.1. We still, however, need to include the Moz vendor prefix for Firefox and the WebKit prefix for Chrome and Safari. Also, iOS, Safari, Android, and BlackBerry. Multi-column layout introduces a new type of column box container where the content is flowed into multiple column boxes. In our HTML file, we have a div with the class main containing 3 lengthy paragraphs, as we can see here in Chrome. So we'll go ahead and divide this text into multiple columns. And our main div will act as our container for the multi-column layout. So first, let's start with the column count property, which lets us set the number of columns. So in our main rule, we'll first type the WebKit vendor prefix, since I'm using Chrome, followed by column count. And we'll go ahead and define a column count of 3. So we'll save this. And when we refresh, we can see that no matter how wide or narrow our screen is, the content will always be split into 3 columns. We can then set gaps in between the columns with the column gap property. So once again, I'll type the WebKit vendor prefix, followed by column gap, and we'll define a column gap of 3em. When we refresh the browser, we can see that all the columns have these equal gaps in between them, and they're 3ems wide, or about 54 pixels. Next, we can use the column rule properties to define rules or borders between each column. The column rule properties are column rule width, column rule style, and column rule color. So let's go ahead and define these. We'll give it a column rule width of 2 pixels. And for the column rule style, we'll define that as dotted. Now this can also be dashed, solid, and any of the other values that the border style property accepts. And for the color, we'll go ahead and define a dark blue hex value. So we'll save this. And when we refresh, we can see how the column rules appear in the middle of these column gaps. But we can define all of these in just one property using the column rule shorthand. So in our column rule shorthand, we'll define the rule width and the column rule style, followed by the color. And then we can go ahead and remove these individual values up here. And if we need our columns to be a specific width, we can use the column width property. So once again, the WebKit vendor prefix, followed by column width. And we'll specify a width of 250 pixels. We'll save this. So now our columns will always be 250 pixels wide. So this is sort of like a max width for our columns. Because as you can see, when the browser window or screen size is narrow, the column count is reduced to fit the screen by flowing its content into less columns that are 250 pixels wide until it's reduced to a single column. So this is really great for responsive web design. We can also simply use the columns property as a shorthand, which sets both the column width and the column count properties at the same time. So below our column width here, I'll just define WebKit columns, and I will define the column width first of 250 pixels, followed by the column count of 3. And now we can get rid of the individual values for the width and the column count. And if we add an image anywhere in the text, it will also follow the flow of the columns. So for example, in our HTML file, I'll go ahead and add an image in between the paragraphs. When we refresh, we can see the image, but we'll still need to adjust a few things in order for it to fit nicely within our columns. So back in our CSS, we'll need to select the image, and we will give it a display property with a value of block. We'll follow that with some top and bottom margins. And finally, we'll need to give it a maxed width of 100% so that it always takes up the exact width of its column. And now when we refresh, we see our image aligned nicely in our middle column, but it will also flow with the columns when our browser width is resized. Finally, we can use the column span property to span elements across several columns. So in our HTML, I will go ahead and add a heading 1 to the top of the page. When we look at it in the browser, it displays in the first column only. But we can tell the browser to span it across multiple columns with the column span property. So in our CSS, we'll select our heading 1. Then we'll declare our column span property. And we will give it the value all. In our browser, we can see how the heading 1 spans across all of our columns, and it establishes a new block formatting context. As we just learned, the main benefit of using the multi-column layout feature is flexibility, because it allows us to achieve scalable layouts that fit all types of screen sizes. The multi-column layout module has been a candidate recommendation since April 2011, so hopefully soon it will be recommended as a web standard and we can begin using it unprefixed in all browsers.